Let me tell you who Alex Edmans is. Professor of Finance at London Business School. He has a PhD from MIT as a Fulbright Scholar and was previously a tenured professor at Wharton and investment banker at Morgan Stanley. Let's carry on. Alex has spoken at the World Economic Forum in Davos, testified in the UK Parliament. He gave the TED Talk, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, and the TEDx Talk, The Social Responsibility of Business, with a combined 2 million views. He serves as a Mercers School Memorial Professor of Business at Gresham College, giving a 4-year program of lectures to the public and on Royal London Asset Management's Responsible Investment Advisory Committee. And he's written the wonderful book, Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. He was featured in the Financial Times list of business books of the year for 2020 with this, and been named to Poets and Quants Best 40 Professors Under 40 and Thinkers50 Radar. How about that for a bio? That is a fascinating career, Alex. It's incredible the work you're doing. The time is 17:39. I welcome you to the virtual stage for the next 20 minutes when Jaisal will come back in to give her thanks and take questions. Alex, the stage is very much yours.
Great, thanks so much, Richard. And if you heard Richard's bio, there was no mention at all of any expertise whatsoever in AI or tech. And so I'm really grateful that nobody sort of dialed out, because I have to admit, I have no knowledge on this topic, but I do have knowledge on business. And so what I'm going to specifically focus on is responsible business. So why Richard invited me is to talk about responsible AI. However, rather than trying to sort of garble it and pretend to apply my stuff to AI, he thought it'd be clearer for me just to present the research findings on responsible business, and then you will automatically be able to make the leap for your organizations and the context that you're in of how this applies. And I'd be obviously really happy to be challenged on that in the Q&A. But that's just a little bit of a caveat in case you thought, well, why is he not talking about AI? But the principles that I'm going to apply have been applied to many areas of business, be this banking, be this healthcare, and be this AI and tech. So it's great to have this opportunity to present to this new audience. Now, I think a good place to start is just to explain to you, right, why are we even thinking about responsibility and what does it even mean? And to do this, I think I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey, right? It's late today, it's nearly 6 o'clock, nearly dinner time, but let's try to wake you up and take you halfway around the world. So I'm going to take you to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 2 continents and 6,000 kilometers from Lebanon in Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains, like this one, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi, which is in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. Now you might think, well, it's hard to imagine that you're here because you haven't seen it before. But in fact, some of you might have seen it before, not on the small screen of your home laptops, but on the big screen of a movie theater. It was featured in the blockbuster thriller, The Constant Gardener, which came out about 15 years ago. Now, millions of people around the world have seen this lake because they've seen this movie, but fewer than 1,000 people call the lake their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, and he makes a living selling and herding goats. Now, for Emmanuel, it used to be that cash was king, as the saying goes. If he sold a goat, he'd get cash, but then he'd have to check that cash and worry about forgery. And he'd have to store that cash and worry about being robbed. And then to bank that cash, he had to trek to the nearest bank, which was an entire day away. So his life was really tough. He couldn't graze his goats in the greenest pastures. He had to always be within 1 day of a bank. But all of this changed due to a responsible business. And in fact, the example I've chosen was a responsible business acting in the tech space. So this business was Vodafone. So in 2007, and I'm sure you'll know this example, they launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service in Kenya. Now, let me explain what mobile money is. I'm sure you'll know this more than me, but often people think it's mobile banking, right? I have a bank account and I can operate it on my phone. I don't need to go to the branch to do that. But actually, with mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. And that was really powerful because at the time, 15 million Kenyans had no access to the banking system. So this absolutely transformed Emmanuel's life. Right, he no longer needs to deal with robbery or forgery, and he can place his goats where he wants to, and he has a record of every transaction on his phone. But I don't want to make a big thing out of just one story, but more generally, a study found that within the first 7 years of launching M-Pesa, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty, and many of these households are headed up by women because they allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail, so there was a huge effect on gender parity. Okay, so that's my first story about Vodafone and responsibility, but let's now explain another story of Vodafone. And this surrounds tax, which is also something which is a big concern for AI or anything in tech. Right, why? Because in all of these industries, you could choose to locate your IP in low tax jurisdictions. So when you think about responsible AI, you might think that actually fair tax is an important consideration. And indeed, this is why Vodafone became the first telecoms company around the world in 2012 to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they're paying to governments worldwide. You might think, well, why am I introducing this with just these two stories? Is it just to sort of wake you up late in the evening? But no, I'd like us to think about these two questions. So the first is, which of these decisions created most value for society? Was this M-Pesa or was this tax transparency? And the second is, which of these decisions, if it had not been taken, would have led to the most public outrage or worsen Vodafone's ESG rating or reputation? Now, I'm not going to poll anybody here because I'm pretty sure that most people would agree with the answers. So which decision created most value for society? It was the first one, right? By launching M-Pesa, they lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and contributed to gender parity. But let's turn to the second question. What would have been the outrage if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa? It would have been nothing, right? You don't get a massive customer boycott for not launching an innovation. You would have not been slammed by the media for not coming up with this crazy idea of banking without a bank, because nobody would have even thought it was possible to begin with. But what is the backlash for being not transparent on tax? It is massive. Vodafone themselves had suffered a nationwide boycott of their stores in 2010. And indeed, if you think about the tech sector, right, one of the big things that's leveled across many of the tech giants today is their tax position. So what am I telling you in this opening example? Right, well, often we think about responsibility as being the answer to the second question, right? So do no harm. So for normal businesses, that might be not cheating on taxes, not mistreating workers, and not polluting the environment. In terms of responsible AI, that might be things such as data privacy, security, ensuring that algorithms that we use are not biased against particular demographic characteristics. But all of those things are really important, right? Don't get me wrong. But you already knew that before coming on this webinar. You didn't need me to tell you, right, that responsibility is about avoiding harm. Instead, what I like to do is to move our attention more to the first question, is that responsibility is about actively doing good. Right? How much value can we actively create by doing some crazy things like launching banking without a bank, because that is the primary way in which we might be able to serve wider society. And so this goes to the framework that I introduced in the book that Richard kindly mentioned. We like to think that a company creates some value, and that value can be given by a pie. And we can split the pie to investors in the form of profits and society in the form of value. So let's go back to AI. So that value might be higher taxes to the government, or that value might be paying customers for the data. So one of the big controversies is, indeed, if you're a user of, say, Google and so on, you're providing a lot of data and you're not being paid for it. So is there a fairer way to split the pie so that we give up profits to help wider society? And again, right, fair splitting is important. But the goal of my talk is to change our thinking about responsibility and to highlight that fairness and equality, while they seem good things, that can't just be what responsible AI is about. Why? For at least two reasons. The first reason is, well, it's not good for the profits of a company, right? So if you're a responsible business leader, you might think, let's just do responsibility to the minimum extent possible because it's going to hammer my profits. And indeed, as I'm sure you'll know, 18 months ago in the US, 181 chief executives signed this business roundtable statement showing how much they would serve wider society. But when the rubber hit the road in the pandemic, many of them just didn't put it into practice. And why would they? Right, if responsible business just means making my company less profitable, let me just not do that. So the second reason why also responsibility can't be seen as a fair split of the pie is that it's just bad for investors. Now, many politicians might say, I don't care. Right, we like to see investors as nameless, faceless capitalists. But in fact, investors play a huge role in society. Right, they include parents saving for their children's education, pension funds saving for retirement. And so we need to ensure that investors have a large share of the pie in order to be a responsible tech company. So this is why my view about responsibility is that it's about growing the pie. It's about actively creating value, being relentlessly committed to innovation and excellence, doing some crazy ideas like banking without a bank. And the beauty of that is that even if responsibility is driven by the idea of serving wider society, magically, investors might profit anyway. Right, so if I go back to the idea of Vodafone, right, when they launched this idea of M-Pesa, they genuinely did it in order to solve this problem of financial inclusion in Kenya. They didn't do it to make money, but eventually they were able to monetize it and become more profitable. So the other thing that you might have been struck by when Richard read my bio is not just the lack of tech skills, but the fact that I'm a finance professor, not an ethics professor, not a professor of philosophy. And often people who are in finance, they might think that responsibility is just a waste of money. It's just a distraction. Our business is to be profitable. But what a lot of my research is suggesting is that actually responsibility is not at the expense of profitability. It actually is boosting the bottom line. Now, at this point, you might think, well, where's the evidence? Right? I've sort of come up with a story, claiming that serving society pays off, but I use the word magically. And magic doesn't exist in the real world. What we need is hard evidence. So what my main job as a business school professor is to look across hundreds and hundreds of companies in different sectors and different time periods, and to look at, is it indeed the case that responsibility pays off in the long term, or are just responsible companies fluffy companies who are distracted from the bottom line? And the big challenge here is to define what is a responsible company. Right now, the difficulty is that you could just look at a company's statement and a company might make a nice statement, but not actually put it into practice. So rather than me looking at the input of what a company does, what it actually says, I wanted to look at the output, what value it actually contributes. Now, the challenge here is, well, how do we look at society? Right, society contains many different members. There is the environment, there's customers, there's employees. I chose to focus on employees. So why did I do this? Well, first is this idea of materiality I'm going to come back to later. Right, the environment seems to be the order of the day. Everybody cares about climate change, but maybe for some industries, particularly AI, right, that is not a hugely important part of society. For maybe energy companies and mining companies, that's more important. Whereas for most companies, employees are a key asset. That's true in manufacturing, that's true in services, and so they are a key stakeholder. Second reason why I thought it was important to focus on employees is I had a really good measure available, which was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. So why was this list so important? It's because it started in 1984. So this whole idea of responsibility is a pretty new phenomenon. And many data sources that we have on a company's responsibility have only been around for the last 10 years. And if I showed you that responsibility paid off using data from 2010 to 2019, you might think, well, those last 10 years were a boom year for the stock market. Maybe right now in a pandemic, we shouldn't think about responsibility at all. We should just think about survival and making money. But because my data started in 1984, it contained the collapse of the internet bubble. It contained the financial crisis. It contained September 11th. And so I could show that this is something which is robust to bad times as well as good. Now, as we know, correlation does not imply causation. It could be that responsibility leads to profits, or it could be that profits allow a company to start thinking about responsibility. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all of the details of how I addressed that, but to be clear, this is why it took me so long to complete the study, was to rule out all of those other possibilities. Instead, I want to get to the bottom line because that's what's important for practitioners, which is all of you. So I found that the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered stock returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. So simply put, companies that treat their workers better are not just fluffy, worthy companies. They're companies that are being serious and commercial and protecting their critical assets. Now, you might think, well, that's all well and good, what I've said so far, but how do we put this into practice? Right, I've said, yes, we need to be responsible, and this is not just good for society, it's good for long-term commercial success, but how do we think about responsibility for my specific business? How does this apply to AI when we think not just about our employees, but maybe other aspects of society? I think a good place to start is just to think about what it means to be purposeful to begin with, right? The word purpose is bandied around a lot nowadays, often without thinking about what it actually means. Now, some companies will use statements like this. Our purpose is to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, and communities, and generate returns to investors. And that sounds fantastic, but it's really unrealistic, because in reality, you will face trade-offs. Go to AI in particular, write something which is going to be very successful, that will probably lead to some job losses. And so if our purpose is to serve customers and workers, well, maybe some technology will help customers, but that might well be at the expense of employees. So if your purpose statement is to be all things to all people, right, it's not going to be something which is going to help us make daily decisions. So going back to what the word purpose means, it doesn't mean altruistic. It means being focused and targeted, right? A purposeful meeting is one with a clear agenda. And if I do something on purpose, I'm going to do it deliberately. So what it means for a company to be purposeful is it's not your responsibility to solve all of the world's problems, but to focus on the couple of problems that you are best placed to solve. Right, for example, Baidu, the technology company, their purpose statement is to use technology to make the world simpler. Right, their goal of technology is to help society by making the world simpler. They didn't say to use technology to guarantee full employment and no job losses. It may well be that in some cases, using technology to make the world simpler will lead to some job losses, but that is not part of their purpose, right? Their key thing they're focusing on is indeed to ensure that the world becomes simpler. Now, what does this mean in terms of our employees, right? Should we just ignore them and say, by the way, tough luck, you're not part of our purpose statement, we're going to make you redundant? Absolutely not. But what it does mean is that we first take the decision based on purpose, right? Who are the most important stakeholders? And then if there are people losing out, right, then we try to make sure that their losses are mitigated. So if we go to Airbnb, right, the tech company which has sort of revolutionized the hotel industry, right, the travel industry more generally, what did they do last year? Well, they had to cut 25% of their workforce because they know that even after the pandemic subsides, the travel industry is not going to be back to normal. But rather than saying, okay, we've got to let you go, what they did is they made sure that they had 14 weeks of severance pay, even though in the US, there's no minimum severance pay, that they had a year of healthcare, which is important in the pandemic, that also they got to keep all of their laptops because they need them to find another job. And also the recruitment department was then changed into an outsourcing department, an outplacement department, in order to help the others find new jobs. Now, all of this is costly, but what is the benefit of Airbnb doing that, in addition to it just being the right thing to do? Well, it's good business, right? So how does this affect, say, the reputation that Airbnb has? This was massively positive. And indeed, when they made the announcement of 25% job losses, normally there'd be massive publicity, but this was something where there was a lot of positive publicity. And also, what about the workers who remained, the 70% of people who stayed at the company? Some of those 25% would have been their colleagues and their friends. And now they were safe knowing that even though they were out of a job, at least the company had taken some action in order to ensure that they were well treated. And so that was something which was beneficial and important for morale. Okay, so how do we choose, right, out of all of those different stakeholders, who to focus on? This is going to be revisiting the idea of materiality that I alluded to earlier, and this is going to be the final study I'm going to take you through before handing back to Giselle for the Q&A. So what I'm showing you here is the materiality map of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is a body trying to focus companies on thinking about their wider societal impact. Now, what they do is they go industry by industry to highlight who are the most material or important stakeholders for that industry. So if you're in the mining industry, right, the environment is really important, right? For example, if you blow up Juukan Gorge like Rio Tinto, then you're going to have a huge problem. But if you're in the financial sector, and also this would apply to the tech sector, right, maybe the environment isn't so important. Your direct effect on the environment is not massive, unless, say, you're doing something like mining Bitcoins. Instead, what matters much more are things like customer privacy, data security, selling practices and product labeling, right? So when somebody joins a particular social media platform, do they know what is happening to the data? Is there something which is transparent? When a setting changes, let's say on Facebook, so that something now becomes opt out rather than opt in, is this clear to me? And so what does this study do? So what this study looks at is perhaps the best known data set for ESG, environmental, social and governance data, MSCI. And it looked at companies that did well across the board. They did well on every social issue. So they did well on the environment, they did well to customers, they did well to taxpayers. And these companies actually did not beat the market. They only beat the market by 1.5% per year, which was insignificant. But when they then redid the study and they focused on the material issues, i.e. they looked at how well the company did on the material things, but then they wanted companies to scale back and not do so well on the immaterial things, they did beat the market by 4.8%. And it's just worth pausing a moment just to reflect on the significance of this result, right? And suggest that a responsible company is not something that's all things to all people. They're not trying to solve every one of the world's problems or contribute to all 17 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but to think about, well, what are the most material parts of society for my company? And let me ensure I do really well on those. And it doesn't matter if this means that I actually have to slightly de-emphasize the others. So as Richard kindly mentioned, why I wrote this book last year was just to show to people that responsibility, I think for far too long, had been viewed as fluffy. But it's an optional extra Maybe as a responsible AI company, I need to think about responsibility to avoid a big PR scandal or newspaper backlash. But beyond that, I don't really need to think about it. I should just focus on profitability. But what this is trying to highlight is that these things are not necessarily in conflict. They're actually consistent with each other. And this is not just something in academic research. One of the other hats I wear, as Richard also mentioned, is serving on the Responsible Investment Committee of Royal London Asset Management. And we are very pro AI and technology. This is a sector we actively will be investing in. But what we're trying to think about is when we invest in the sector, we need to look at something which is best in class. So it's not just based on the financial growth potential that we're thinking about, but also the contribution that's being made to wider society, because that contribution will ultimately lead to shareholder returns in the long term. Okay, so thank you so much to everybody for their attention and for allowing a non-AI person to gate crash this. So let me hand back to Jaisal. Really happy to answer any questions and challenges that you might have.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex. And I think it has been an interesting talk. And it was, I think you have really a knack of speaking so well, especially talking about purpose, about the business rationale behind it, and the purpose that companies need to look at. Looking at your book, definitely about the trade-off that you need to have for all of them. And I think what you shared about M-Pesa, how it has led to economic growth, where people think that business or monetization cannot have a purpose. That's not really true. They can go hand in hand if it is done the right way, even though there are trade-offs. We do know about that totally. But I think today businesses are looking for purpose, and it is not just a buzzword, I would say, but definitely people are looking for it. And I'll just move on to the questions right now. So I've just noted them. So one is from Alex again. I'm more interested in why Vodafone did this, for profit, for market share, or just because they are nice guys. I think this question is really relevant. Yeah,
it's a great question. So I'm sorry, Jay, so I missed the first part of the question when you read it out. Could you repeat it?
Yeah.
Why would...
So I'm more interested in why Vodafone did this, for profit, for market share, or just because they are nice guys. I think it relates to M-Pesa and the transparency tax report.
Oh, so why would Vodafone do it?
Yeah.
So that was really interesting. So in 2005, which was 2 years before they launched it, what was Vodafone's strategy at the time? It was to win spectrum license auctions in the West. Right? It was just to expand in the West, because that was the market share that they cared about. So it wasn't sort of a strategic decision to diversify into Kenya, but they had a small division which was tasked with the idea of using technology to enhance socio-economic progress. So I would say genuinely, it was because they were nice guys, even though it might be hard to think that a large corporation will do that. I actually know Nick Hughes, who was the head of the mobile payments division. He's now an executive fellow at London Business School. So what they did is they noticed that within Kenya, because they didn't want to use cash, they were transferring mobile minutes, right? You get sort of a monthly allowance, and there was a possibility of transferring that. They were using that like cash, and they thought, well, why can't we use our technology to transfer cash rather than these mobile minutes? And I won't give Vodafone all the credit, because partly was the UK government. So DFID, the Department for International Development, they teamed up with Vodafone, and so this was a joint project which they did. One other thing I want to say is it cost Vodafone £1 million to launch that. Now you might think, well, that sounds massive. But actually, the total investment budget for Vodafone that year was 4.2 billion. So 1 million is peanuts. So often people think, well, responsibility, that involves a massive expenditure, but it doesn't. Sometimes it involves just thinking broadly and thinking outside the box, thinking, well, given my expertise of technology, what are the new things that I can use, I can solve with this? And indeed, what we've seen right now in the pandemic is many companies using their expertise in different ways. So Mercedes, for example, they're great at engineering. They're engineering now not Formula One engines, but CPAP breathing machines, which are a less invasive alternative to ventilators.
Yeah, thank you. I'll move on to the next question that we have. I think there's a lot of discussion going on this one. So it's from Leon. Can someone please provide a specific example of ethical AI in businesses? I'm failing to see the differentiation between ethical AI and simple data ethics in its original form.
So I'm happy if someone closer to AI can answer that question. If not, I will have a crack at it. Is it possible for you to, Joyce, to put the sort of the copy and paste the wording into the chat for me? Just because if I see the question, I understand a little bit better if I see it.
Yeah, it's on the chat already.
I couldn't see it.
Yeah, it's actually, I've picked it from the chat. It's the people are typing onto the chat itself. Okay. So
it got buried. The question was for me, if you just want me to ask it.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. Hi, Alex. Thank you for your time. I'm fairly new to this. I've been in the data game for 15 years, but I just took a data science boot camp, so now I actually understand the mechanics of machine learning and all that. And I hear the term ethical AI thrown around a lot. But what I'm failing to see is the difference between ethical AI and just normal data privacy that's been, that's had legislation surrounding it for years and years and years. I mean, at a specific example of AI in itself.
Yeah, so I actually don't see a huge difference between being ethical AI and just being really good and really great scientists. And I think that's really important, right? Because often people think, well, responsibility is about giving loads of money to charity or reducing your carbon footprint. But for me, let's say as the finance professor, the best way that I'm an ethical professor is not the fact that I bike to London Business School rather than taking an Uber, but the fact that I will really research every lecture that I give to make sure that it's relevant rather than just theoretical. And so when this applies to AI, so what is ethical AI? So I know that I think there were some algorithms which were trying to detect whether somebody was a criminal or not a criminal based on their facial features. And this and what they looked at was, they said, well, sort of the width between the eyes and sort of the shape of the mouth was what was linked to whether you're criminal or not. And actually what they did is they looked at some mug shots from convicted criminals, and they also looked at some photos from non-criminals. Now, the difference was the actual photos from non-criminals were self-submitted photos, and therefore often those photos had people smiling. And whereas the mug shots, people don't smile, and when you smile, that automatically changes some features of your face. And what that led to was just a lot of just problems there, where people were just what the algorithm was picking up was whether you're smiling or not, rather than whether your face was in a particular way or not. And I see you're smiling right now, and you might think, well, why is that ethical? Isn't that just good AI? Isn't that just sensible good AI? But this is why I think there's a lot of overlap between them. So when a lot of companies try to be responsible, I think the first thing they do is to be, excuse my language, just to be damn good at your job, right? If what you're trying to do is science, be a top tier scientist. So before you post a black square on Instagram, or before you give a lot of money to charity, make sure that when you're doing something like this is you're making sure the science is perfect. Now, the other thing I'd say is that when you try to, if you're trying to highlight the results of a study or the power of your AI, just make sure that you're acknowledging the limitations of it. So sometimes people say, like, I've developed this algorithm and it's been massively back-tested and it's applicable to all of these situations. But if you only tested it, let's say within white males within the UK, that doesn't mean that the algorithm will be used successfully in other contexts. And so I think that's another reason in which something might not be ethical or not be scientific.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Liam. I think I have posted the 2 questions on your chat as well. So one from Anna, when you mentioned about what is responsibility in context to that, Anna has mentioned actively doing good for whom and who decides that?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question and an important challenge. And I think if for whom, it depends on one thing that I didn't have to, I glossed over in my talk, but I called it comparative advantage. And so what this is that who is the people in society that you are best placed to serve given your expertise? For example, for me, as a finance professor, part of my job should be to mentor PhD students. I do virtually none of that. Okay, I'm really irresponsible and really lazy on that. Why? Because I think my comparative advantage is the business connection. Right? I used to work in business before being a professor. I love dealing with the real world. So I'm choosing for my sort of serve society, actively doing good, is to talk to business people, even if they're business people outside my core field, such as all of you. And similarly for a company, right, it could be that the AI is going to be used for one specific purpose in one specific country or one specific demographic. And if so, I would just focus on that, but to think about your specific expertise and where that will apply. Let me just give you one example. I'm afraid it's outside of AI, but that might you might hopefully see the link. Coca-Cola has this initiative called Project Last Mile, which it uses to distribute medicines and vaccines everywhere in Africa, including the difficult last mile to a rural school or hospital. So why do they focus on delivery, not climate change or diversity? Well, its expertise is in transport and logistics. They need to make sure that Coke is available everywhere in Africa, including the local village. Now you might think, well, if they're good at delivery, why don't they deliver books? Because literacy is a challenge in Africa. But what you need about vaccines is they must be transported cold. And because Coca-Cola transports drinks cold, that's what their expertise is. So I think whenever we think about who to solve, it should be linked to our core expertise.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I think it has answered a few of the questions. There are still more questions in the chat. I have posted you in direct message as well. And it's on the chat with the audience if you are able to answer them directly over there. And I'm really glad to, summarize the talk for you. And over to you, Richard, for the next speaker.
Absolutely. So I'll try to answer any of the questions here. And if there's further questions that people have sort of outside the chat, if you drop me a note on LinkedIn, I commit to getting back to people on all the questions they might have. Thank you so much for your attention.